Hello, and welcome to the Superhero-Fiction Convention of Heroes. This is the 2021 panel on creating a hero. If you're actually looking for tips on how to raise the dead, sorry, wrong panel. The panel on writing superhero romance will be on Wednesday, and I'm certain they'll have tips on that. What we do have is a talented group of authors who write in multiple superhero subgenres, so hopefully we'll touch on something useful, interesting, or funny for everyone watching. I'm particularly voting for the funny. If you are watching live, feel free to submit your questions and they'll be forwarded to us so that I can put the panel on the spot with them if we have a chance. My name is Karen Diem, and I'll be your friendly neighborhood moderator because even conference organizers make questionable decisions sometimes. I write the ARCA superhero urban fantasy series following the adventures of Zeta Garcia and her friends as they attempt to have lives despite supervillains and hefty helpings of Murphy's Law. Now, to get started, Amanda, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I am Amanda Cherry, representing the villain contingent on this panel. I am www.thegingervillain.com. I am a small press and traditionally published author of superhero fiction and contemporary and historical urban fantasy, as well as role-play games. I will also be on that Dirty Romance panel later this week, so be sure to tune into that. I am super excited to talk character creation with this amazing group of authors today. And I am coming to you live from an undisclosed offshore location.
Nancy?
Sure. Hi, my name is Nancy O'Toole. I write superhero fiction and fairy tale retellings. This includes the Red and Black series, which just released its fourth book, Past and Future, earlier this year, where I got to bring in time travel into my superhero world.
Jeff?
Hi, everybody. I'm Jeff Elkins. I'm coming from just north of Baltimore, Maryland, and I write superhero fiction that are supernatural thrillers. My series, The Defense of Reality, follows homeless superheroes that are protecting cities around the world from monsters from another world.
And last but not least, Dennis?
Hi, my name is Denny Upkins, or Dennis Upkins. I write superhero fiction like the others. My titles Hollowstone and West of Sunset were released through Parker Publishing, and I've also done short stories. Monsters Among Us and Stranger Than Fiction have also been published, or superhero fiction. In addition to that, I'm a freelance journalist, and I discuss everything from comic book movies and critiquing them, or television series. I've written from everyone from Black Girl Nerds, comicbook.com, and my work has been featured from Harvard Political Law and TV News and others.
Okay, great. I told you guys we had a good crowd here today. All right, let's get started with our first question. It is the classic chicken or the egg. Do you build the plot first or the hero or something else? Why? Dennis?
I think it's sort of they're interchangeable. Character is story, and story is character. So, the character arc should be, what their journey is, and the other stuff kind of falls into place. But you can't do one without the other. So it's like, what is their arc? What is their character conflict? What is it that they're trying to overcome internally, as well as the conflicts they have externally?
Okay. Jeff?
Yeah, I'd agree. I think when I start with a series, I definitely start with the struggle the hero is going to have to overcome. So the struggle the hero is going to have to overcome leads to the hero and the plot at the same time. I think focusing in on that, great villain or that really fantastic challenge that the hero is going to have helps me build out the hero and the world that they're going to exist in.
Nancy?
Very similar for me, actually. Obviously, what comes first depends a lot on the actual project. But while usually the first spark of information is related to character, usually like the characters and the world and the plot, they get developed in tandem. So like I'll come up with an idea for character first, but how I develop them will depend a lot on the overall plot and the world that they're in.
And Amanda?
It kind of depends. I very much write character-driven stories. I write a lot of very close third person or first person stories. So I do need to know that person very well. But sometimes I'll just get an inkling of, I want to do a superhero origin story set in the world of, like, right now I'm sketching out one that's set in the world of pro wrestling in the 1980s. So I kind of know who I want that character to be. But the next thing I need to figure out is what problems she's going to solve, like how she's going to come into her power. And so I need some plot points to then go back and say, all right, and now how do her powers manifest? So it's very much person, problem, power in that order.
Okay, that's great. And just to note, obviously, we've got a great group of authors and all that, but everybody's process is going to be different. And like was mentioned, it will vary from book to book. So I know that I have previously heard people saying they started with one or the other, except for this one book where they had to, do wrestling in the 80s. Do you have a set process when you're building a character? What do you focus on first? Powers, personality, backstory, diversity? Amanda, let's start with you.
I usually focus on backstory, which shapes personality, and kind of get that in there first, because I need every decision the character makes to feel organic. And so I need to know who they are. As far as diversity, I do my best not to write outside my lane, which to me says that no one is heterosexual in any of my books unless there's a really compelling story reason for it. But I do try to make sure that I surround them with a cast of diverse persons. And if that means I'm going to wind up hiring 6 sensitivity readers, well, I'll just put that in the budget. But really, I try to know who they are as a person first, because if I don't know them well enough to convince you to go on a 300-page journey with them, then what am I doing?
Good question. Nancy?
I don't have a set process, but I do notice that there's a difference between my fantasy books and my superhero books. And with superhero books, a lot of time it really does start off with the powers. And at that point, I do think it's sort of important to think about, okay, but what does this character want? Is that such an important question when it comes to the overall direction of the story? But as for whether I get into sort of personality or backstory next, that depends a lot on the individual characters. With Alex, for example, he's the love interest of the main character. When it came to sort of piecing together his backstory, I knew at the beginning that he had recently started to work as a henchman for the main villain of the book, Calypso. So I began to think, ask myself why questions. Why does he work for Calypso? Why would he want to do that? Well, maybe it's due to financial reasons. Okay, then why does he need so much money? Well, he has to support his sisters, including one that's a minor, and then so on and so forth. You sort of get the idea. And as I dug into his powers, I began to learn more about who he was as a person. Alex has these really destructive powers that are triggered by rage. And that means a lot of his personal storylines are going to be connected to anger. So why is Alex angry? Which is a question that's gotten more complicated the further you get into the series. It sort of go on from there. And as for diversity, we live in a diverse world, and I enjoy reading stories with diverse casts. So I feel like it makes sense for me to include a diverse cast of characters.
Okay. Jeff?
Yeah, so once I have the problem in mind, then the build of the character comes from thinking about what attributes of that character, and specifically what character voice is going to be the most interesting when faced with that problem. Very much like what Amanda and Nancy said. So with my book 12 Commandments, which follows the superhero Jose, at the time when I wrote it, I was working with a large amount of homeless addicts. And so just noticing how they were ignored by society and kind of pushed out to the margins, the question kind of became like, what if there was a superhero hiding amongst these addicts? What would that hero look like? And that led me to the mentor character in that book, which was Chris, who is vet that's returned from home to discover this calling to protect the world around him, and that being a 24-hour job, not being able to like make a living the streets. And then, what led me to Jose was the question of like, well, what does his like opposite look like if I could give him a sidekick? So, you've got this kind of grizzled, embattled, war-torn Chris partnered with this kid, a Hispanic kid who's been abandoned, who also comes across this calling to defend the city around him and invest himself in that life. And so for me, it was about like pairing the strengths and weaknesses of the two characters in relation to this situation. Or in one of the later books in the series, Mencken and the Lost Boys, I pull three young teens out of the city and bring them into the world as heroes. And for them, again, it was like the question of like what teens would really struggle to be seen and noticed by this world, what teens would have a difficult time with the world around them, complicating the issues they're having while they're trying to do their jobs. So it's that conflict pairing it with fun character strengths and weaknesses that are really going to bring about a lot of tension in the story.
Not to mention just having to resolve the fact that they're teenagers and therefore a little bit out there at times.
Yeah, or for Jose that he's homeless and needs to find food. Right,
Yeah.
like this, figuring out like the small details of what it looks like to live in this world for those characters, I think makes the story more fun and engaging for me to write. Hopefully for readers to read as well.
We all hope.
Yeah.
Okay, Denny.
Pretty much similar to what the others have explained. For me, being a person of color and an LGBTQ, you're constantly, and I hate to say it, even in the 21st century. You're still breaking barriers. You're still being the first. And then when you're writing your stories, you have an opportunity to educate others. For me, anytime I write, whether it's a blog post, a novel, a short story, whatever, I write by what I call the E cubed directive. E cubed as in the number 3. I try to write the intent to empower, to enlighten, or to entertain. So if I can do all three, so much the better. So diversity obviously hits home to me because I still think that goes back to story and character development. One of the characters in Hollowstone, she was going to be introduced in the second half of the book to help the narrator. Originally, I had envisioned her being a male because I knew there were going to be some action scenes and he was going to have a background in martial arts. And then I asked myself, why does it have to be a guy? Why does he have to be straight? Why not be bisexual? And why couldn't she be pagan or Wiccan too? And she's a high school, so by even changing those dynamics, it introduced new opportunities to tell stories and narratives, and it changed the landscape because now you've got these amazing different characters that have all these complications and story arcs, and it gives you more to work with stories. So that's why a lot of times too, when people do reboots of stories, and they'll put a POC lead in instead of another straight white male, is because it opens up opportunities because you can tell other stories or address other issues. And, and it gives me an opportunity to do that even with science fiction and or fantasy or superhero fiction as well. So it still goes back to, character arc and development. And even with the powers, it's a manifestation or an extension of who they are or what they're struggling with. So that's what has worked for me thus far.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let's go to our next question then. As we touched on a little bit earlier, no discussion of superheroes is really complete without talking a little bit about superpowers. I know this is a subject that superfans can argue about for days on, which ice caster is the strongest, who's faster in all the speedsters, which brick makes the best wall to throw people against. But here the question is, are they necessary? Do your characters have them? On the power scale in your universe, where do your characters usually fall? And does it change throughout the story or books? Let's start with Nancy this time.
Sure. I think that superpowers, of course, they're not necessary. Batman and several superheroes, they do a great job without superpowers. And that's fine. So, but whether or not you decide to include superpowers depends a lot on the world that you have created and the type of story you want to tell. So, if you want to tell like a more grounded street level story, you're probably not going to have Galactus roll in or something like that. But I do feel like even if your character doesn't have superpowers, there still needs to be something about them that is impressive or extraordinary in some way, whether that be really impressive fighting skills honed by, training, or they're really good with technology or something like that. Like superheroes, they don't need to be able to punch holes through the earth, but they still need to have that sort of cool factor. As for my characters, almost all of them have superheroes, have superpowers. I like writing about superpowers. I like thinking about how they work in conflict with each other in fight scenes and stuff like that. But I did have a couple characters show up in book 2 that did not have any superpowers, and they used sort of technology to help them get by. And one of the first thing I did was I gave one of them a concussion that she had to deal with for the rest of the book, as a way to sort of emphasize sort of the difficulty of not having superpowers and being in a world where a lot of the people you're going to be dealing with do have superpowers. And as for whether my protagonists fall, I'd really like to start off a story about characters that have like decently impressive power sets, but I want to give them plenty of room to grow. So as the series progresses, we see the relationship with their powers progress as well, whether that be getting a more nuanced handling of them or seeing those powers develop to dangerous levels beyond their control.
Okay, Jeff?
My characters are about 50-50. Half of the characters in my books don't have powers, and I love that because it demands that like ingenuity of like how to overcome these obstacles without them. I will say my villains always have powers, which is I really like the contrast between the strength of the obstacle and the like the height of the mountain the hero has to climb to get there. So when my heroes have powers, I'm like Nancy. I like the discovery of powers. So, in the Defensive Reality series, Jose starts almost zero knowledge, and by the time you get to book 5, he's really strong and exciting to watch and fairly confident. So it's that like increase in knowledge and understanding of himself and the world around him. And even then though, I couldn't do like a Superman type character where like he seems invincible and has like all the powers in the world. That's not interesting to me. I like the heroes to struggle and have to fight and come up with exciting ways and lean on one another in order to overcome the obstacles they face.
Cool. Dennis?
To Jeff's point, and I agree with Jeff, having powers and knowing how to use them or the person behind them, I think that's what makes them interesting. When you look at some of the most iconic superhero characters, yeah, the powers are cool or whatever, but it's the people behind them what makes them a hero. Whether they've been depowered or whether they have, godlike abilities. It's the human component that makes them amazing. Like Captain America, for instance, Steve Rogers. Yeah, he's enhanced and he's an enhanced soldier, which is kind of cool, but that's not what makes him such an iconic character. He's a simple guy that tries to do the right thing, that tries to embody the best of what America is supposed to stand for. And that's why he's such an enduring character, and that's why he's a fan favorite. So it usually still goes back to who's the character behind the powers and, where they fit. And for me personally, it really just depends on the narrative. For some, they may have powers, for some they don't, but it still goes back to the character in the story.
All right, Amanda. Looking forward to hearing about the villains.
Oh, villains are awesome. Villains are my favorite. I came to superhero fiction a little differently than the rest of the panel, and that is that I came to it through IP. So I walked into a superhero universe that already existed and was already populated with heroes and villains of differing types and kinds and relationships to their power. So I've got everything from Stardust, who is a tech billionaire with a fancy suit that does all sorts of whatever you want it to do, to a girl who is basically part cat. She sort of transforms into a cat and sort of everything in between. We've got the huntsman who has this long legacy of shooting bows and arrows at bad guys. You've got Libertine, you've got Velveteen. So I got acquainted with all of these different power sets so that as I was creating my protagonist, who is a villain in all of their world, I got to figure out how to make her work with them. What am I going to do with her that's going to bug the crap out of them? And then when I go to make a hero like I'm working on now, it's very much a case of trying to decide whether I want her powers to mesh well with her personality or to somehow come in conflict with her personality. So we've got Poison Ivy, who's got these amazing plant powers, and also she's really into plants. But what if you had someone with amazing plant powers who's allergic to everything and she doesn't want to be out in nature ever at all? This is terrible. There are bugs here. Like, what would the relationship to power be like if it's at odds with who the person sees themselves and wants them to be? So I try to create characters that are a good match or foil for the other characters, whether those are of my creation or otherwise. And then I try to create characters that have interesting internal conflict and interesting relationships to their powers, so that again, I write really close third person or first person stories. So I need something to be going on inside of them also that isn't just the other characters driving the bus.
That's awesome. I will say for myself, I actually have a character who's a little bit afraid of his own powers. So, because he got something like a Superman package. So, I had him breaking a lot of stuff in the first book, and he had to figure out on a grad student salary how to pay for a new computer for his friend because he went to turn it on and just like poked his finger through it. Now, still on the topic of powers, but getting a little more seriously, we're going to set aside the heroes whose strongest ability is in choosing hyper-competent sidekicks. Looking at you, Green Hornet, Inspector Gadget, Tick, Harry Potter. For all those other heroes, generally there's something amazing about Spider-Man, superheroes in general. They're frequently aspirational, larger-than-life characters with incredible abilities, skills, underwear, whatever. However, they also need to be relatable enough to make readers want to follow their adventures. How do you reconcile those needs as far as being aspirational and still being human? Let's start with Jeff.
I think growing up for me, my favorite comic books and my favorite heroes were those that like had this kind of like deep emotional wound or pain that they were processing through despite their like enormous power. They had this struggle. So, like Batman comes to mind, constantly looking back at like the death of his family and like pushing through that, or, Spider-Man and his constant like self-consciousness and like, all of the inadequacies that come with being a high school student, and then the death of his uncle and like all of that baggage that he was carrying, feeling like the responsibility of that weight. Those were the heroes that I really connected with. So as I create superheroes in fiction, I think a lot about like, what about their lives? What about their personhood, like who they are, is something that the reader can connect with. So for me, it goes a lot into not just like the mission or the exciting journey they're on, but also the like weight and the luggage that they're carrying along with them, that they're coping with as they go. And I think part of the hardest thing is finding the balance between what's intriguing and what's too dark. I'd love to hear where the other panelists find that kind of. I know that sometimes mine go a little too dark. Like, oh, that baggage is a little like, alcoholism may be a little too heavy for this character to be carrying around all the time. So yeah, anyway, but for me, it's all about that baggage and how it makes the character vulnerable to the world around him.
Okay, Dennis?
For me, and I've said this for years when I've explained it to others, comic books are modern day mythology. So, and I kind of look at it that way. If you look at, Odysseus, Perseus, and yeah, they might be divine heroes, or some of them may have extraordinary abilities. But one of the things that made them heroes were they're put in these epics where they have to beat impossible odds, and the big questions are asked: what are you willing to do to get back to your wife or your family? What sacrifices are you willing to make for country or for your faith? And so it still goes back to that core of they're relatable because they're human and they're having to beat impossible odds to achieve a goal, or they have to sacrifice something, and they just want to be, or they just want to be ordinary people or live an ordinary life, and fate doesn't allow them to do that. So even though the powers might be a metaphor to other things, it still goes back to that's how they're relatable, because many of us have probably been in situations in life where it's like we had to step up or surprise ourselves and beat the impossible odds to achieve a goal or to change our life around or what have you. And it was by some, divine intervention that we did it, but it still goes back to someone having to battle their own demons, like Jeff mentioned, like someone dealing with alcoholism or dealing with the death of a loved one or somehow, and still have to deal with those internal demons to battle the external ones, literal or figurative. So I think that's one of the ways that makes characters, heroes, or protagonists relatable.
Okay, Amanda?
I think when creating superheroes, supervillains, those with magic, those with extraordinary abilities, we have to be super careful not to fall into the trap of creating a bunch of powers in a shiny suit, and really have to worry about making sure there's a whole person in there. Going back partially to what Jeff said, like, what is their pain? What hurts them? What has harmed them? What traumas have they experienced, and what scars have been left by those traumas? But also the inverse of that coin: what brings them joy? What do they love? What would they fight for versus fight against? What kind of music do they like? How did they grow up? What kind of food do they eat? What does that do to their digestive system? Is maybe a spandex suit a bad idea? You really have to get into the flesh and the guts and the highs and the lows and the joys and the pains and the traumas of who that hero is when they're not saving the city. You really need to look deep at who are they, what do they want, and how badly, and get into the human stuff, and then imbue that full realized human with the superpowers. Otherwise, and I say this as me can get caught, so I say to all of you, you can get caught accidentally creating a pile of powers in a shiny suit and realize that they have no personhood and they have no personality, and so their agency feels forced because there's nothing organic that is compelling them.
Okay, Nancy?
Yeah, this is something I think about probably way too much. Just noticing the reactions of people, readers or viewers, or depending on what the medium is, to superhero media, where I feel like there is a fair amount of wish fulfillment when it comes to superheroes. Like there's they have to have this sort of that really cool factor, whether it be through like great powers or awesome fighting abilities, great costumes even, etc. There needs to be some sort of point in the story where your character does something really awesome and your audience thinks, oh wow, that is so cool, I wish I could do something like that. Or gee, if I had those powers, those abilities, money, I would totally do that. Maybe. but similar to what Amanda said, if you only end up giving your characters wins, if they're only like a bunch of powers in a shiny suit, it feels hollow and unearned. And if you only focus on how awesome they are, they're not even all that aspirational anymore because they're so removed from real life that people just can't connect with them anymore. And sort of touching back on what Jeff said about wounds, like I feel like what makes our characters the most relatable is by giving them those struggles, whether that might be like internal struggles against their own faults, or external struggles again, that they need to figure out how to work their way around. Readers, they really don't like it when things are too easy for their heroes. They like there to be a certain level of fairness with their fiction, probably because real life isn't fair a lot. And if you constantly give when you give your characters these wins, they tend to matter more when you feel like your characters have earned through those struggles, especially when those struggles are relatable to the reader in some way.
Those are all really great answers. I actually will add that I think part of it is including the little things about the character that are just like Amanda said, the music they listen to, maybe the reality show that they swear was canceled too early. It only had 28 seasons. Oh my God. I also personally feel like you don't have to necessarily go top end on the powers and still have them be powers that mean something. In my upcoming book Party, that's out in August, I have a side character whose ability as a teacher is to put up to 5 children to sleep for a half hour.
Wow.
I would have
And it's
paid
like,
a good load of money for that at certain periods of my life.
Yes. And it's like, okay, what kindergarten teacher wouldn't like to be able to say, okay, I'm going to sing a little song now, and those 5 little troublemakers are all going to go to sleep. So I think pulling in the little things can really help with all that too. All right. What we're going to do is we're actually going to grab a question from somebody who asked, do you have a favorite power that you want to use but haven't had the chance to use yet? And no, I don't watch reality shows. There are some cheesy shows I do watch that, totally ended too soon. But this is not the place for that, and I'm pretending to be a responsible adult, so I'm not going to go into it. So powers you haven't used that you would like to use. Dennis?
I don't think I have any yet, so at this point, no.
Okay. Amanda,
I guess
go ahead. Finish up.
I was just saying, I
Powers?
don't usually magic. Go ahead.
I would like to get better at writing characters with tech-based powers. I am a total Luddite. As I said, I'm sitting here with no electricity. And I'm very good at writing magic. If you can cast magic missile at it, it's what I want to go up against. And so I'm trying to get better at writing tech-based powers. So I want to do that just for the ability to improve my craft. But I think I'd like to be able to write a character who can disappear. And I think I'd like to be able to write a character who can move through time at a different rate than normal people. But I'm not smart enough to do that yet. We'll see where we are next year or the year after that.
Okay. Nancy?
Yes, definitely 100%. Lots of different powers that I haven't written yet that I would want to. But the issue I come up against a lot is the powers themselves don't really fit into the world that I've created. Like in my world, your powers are basically hereditary. You get them use around puberty and such, kind of like mutants. And so as a result, I can't do the cool magic-based power based around artifacts and stuff like that, which is maybe why I also write fantasy. And there are also some powers that I just haven't really figured out how to make work on a practical level, because I feel like my fantasy world is a little grounded. And I love, for example, Sonic heroes like Black Canary or Present Mike from My Hero Academia. I think that it is just so cool when you have this hero that steps onto a the stage and just screams, and it just ends the fight. It is just so cool. But
Funny how that Hero Academia is snuck in there.
Oh yeah, I have a panel on that tomorrow.
Oh, yeah.
Nancy's
gonna take it there.
Yeah, on heroes and anime and manga tomorrow if you'd like to come and watch. But I love Sonic Heroes, but I haven't been able to figure out how to make it work on like a practical level in my universe, at least not yet. So yeah.
Jeff, you're up.
Yeah, so I've got a couple, but the one I'm working on right now, it's a project that hopefully will launch on Kindle Vella when Kindle Vella launches. But I was really fascinated on how it would work if you could see and talk to the dead, and how that would work as a superpower. So what I'm playing with there, right? Government agency that answers to the FDA, kind of like a low-level government agency that's been forgotten by the government and kind of the world around it, filled with people who go to graveyards every day to gather intel for like what's going on around them. So that's a fun one to play with the whole like seeing and talking to the dead, and kind of giving it like a mundane The Office kind of twist to it. Is what we're going for. So that's one I'm playing with right now. One I really want to play with is the ability to rewind time, and not so much in a like rewinding time so that I could like necessarily change something, but rewinding time in order to like relive it differently, if that makes sense. And I guess the difference for me there is like the ability to rewind it, but not having the control of the predicted outcome, right? Like, so just because you rewind it doesn't mean that everybody else around you is going to behave the way you predict and think that they're going to behave. So I like that idea of kind of like the branching potential of time, kind of like the Loki series is doing right now, but on a much smaller, low-level scale.
Like True Calling?
I haven't seen True Calling or read True Calling. Did they do that in True Calling?
Yeah, it was it stars it was the girl who played Faith on Buffy. It was a Fox series. It lasted for 2 seasons. She could go like back 24 hours if she would try to help stop a murder or something, but it was something along those lines though. She could go back in time, but it wasn't like, it was only like for a day, and would try to, like you described, people didn't always react the way they did. She tried to figure out the mystery, but it was something along that lines. That might be something worth checking out.
Yeah, I'll totally check that out. That's totally what I'm thinking about. And I wasn't even thinking like 24 hours. I was thinking like 15 minutes. If I could like rewind that car crash for 15 minutes to try to avoid it. But then I can see the hero being constantly frustrated that like every time they rewind the car crash, something different happens. And so they can never quite get a grasp on how to solve it. But yeah, thank you. I'll go check that out. That sounds great.
That sounds like the expectation of somebody who doesn't have kids and doesn't know how the same situation can produce different results every time.
Right. Yeah, and maybe that's what I'm feeling. I have 5 children, and I feel like every time I talk to one of them, they all respond radically differently, regardless, even if I say the same thing over and over again. So maybe it's seeded from some kind of deep idea I've got going on.
Parental angst.
That's right. We're like, it doesn't matter what I do. Yeah.
If I say it this way, will he listen this time?
That's right. Maybe if I reverse the order of the words, will it work then? Nope, still doesn't work. Yeah.
Okay, Dennis, did you want to add anything? You sort of got a little cut off earlier. Are you good?
I guess godhood might be one I haven't. I think the question threw me off. That's why I was trying to think, because the thing with superheroes, you can pretty much touch on everything. The sky's the limit. But I think maybe godhood and maybe trying to figure that out, like a god having to deal with mortals or they're losing their powers. Maybe play with that. That'd probably be something I'd like to do in the story.
Yeah, going kind of like Odin and Thor. It's like getting old, needs to go take a long nap type thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Name a favorite superhero or villain you think is well written. Include the iteration if necessary, since we all know the reboots don't always reflect kindly on our favorites. Let's start with Amanda.
I am about to show my age, friends. Gene Hackman's Lex Luthor is always going to be my gold standard for a villain that you can love to watch do the wicked and be the wicked and still be satisfied when Superman foils him at the end of the day. I I love the way he was written, and more than that, I love the way Gene Hackman brought just the right wicked energy to that character, to where you knew he was evil and you understood that about him, but he never felt like a mustache twirling stereotype of a bad guy. His intensity was just flawless, and yeah, Gene Hackman Lex Luthor is forever my fave.
Okay, Nancy.
I'm going to go the opposite and go with something really recent, actually. So I'm going to talk about Scarlet Witch in the MCU, specifically how she was handled in WandaVision, because I felt like up until WandaVision, she was this intriguing background character. Like, we knew she was powerful, but it was unclear of how powerful and how her powers worked. Like, we knew she was a character that experienced all this tragedy and pain and regret, but because she was a background character, that was never really delved into. But WandaVision really changed that. Like, she's still a powerhouse, obviously. And there's a lot that we don't know about her abilities. But we also learned that she's like a person who like retreats from her fear and pain through the medium of television. And dear God, that was so relatable during the pandemic when so many of us sort of binge watched our feelings away as we were locked indoors. So I feel like she came out of that show as a much richer, more relatable character with very human struggles and an awesome new outfit. So I really enjoyed it.
I can't forget about those costume changes. They're very important.
Yes, very important.
I mean, I definitely have now binge watched WandaVision twice. So
Oh yeah, it was so good.
Okay, Jeff.
So I have a couple. I think my two all-time favorite villains, and they're kind of tied for me. I loved Heath Ledger's rendition of the Joker. Man, that was just the like psychological depth of that character, and so much of the like dialogue that he was having. Like, there's a scene where he's in the hospital with Two-Face, and he he says that phrase, "Do I look like the kind of guy that makes plans?" And did like a whole monologue after that about like who makes plans and how they make plans. Is so perfect because he's like right in the middle of this like super elaborate plan. It's fantastic, and I that character is one that's just stuck with me forever. Another villain I love is the Kevin struggling with dissociative identity disorder in the movie Split. That was played by James McAvoy. Um, I just, something about the way that character was written and played was so incredibly relatable that even though he's like eating people at the end of the end of the movie, I really wanted him to be okay.
What's a little cannibalism?
Yeah,
I
just
mean,
a little
really.
cannibalism. I can forgive it. The guy's had so much trauma. So I just, yeah, I totally connected with that one. I think Heroes. I've read the Percy Jackson series to like successfully to like four of my children, and Nico and Annabeth, just those two characters just really click in the books, especially like after book two. And I don't think Nico shows up till book two, but they something about like the kid who got stuck with the underworld powers was really enchanting to me. And then I also really liked the, character who's striving to prove herself and like live up to her mother's legacy and expectations, but the silence that kind of comes from that, and the constant like posturing of justification over like whether or not she is or isn't living up to that legacy. I really enjoyed reading those characters and going back to them over and over again.
you and my 7-year-old should have a chat. My
Yeah.
kid is
Oh my
right
gosh.
now just Percy Jackson everything. If he drops something into the lake, he tells Poseidon that, like, it's all good, I did it on
Nice.
purpose. Yeah.
Yeah. Does
Yeah.
Poseidon ever answer?
So far, no, but
That's
when
perfect.
that
That
day
puts it
comes,
right in line
it'll
with
probably
Percy.
be a book.
Yeah. He and Percy together, never answered by Poseidon. It's great.
By the way, there were a couple of votes for Rosenbaum as Lex Luthor.
I watched a basketball game with him once, and he is a really cool human. And I should watch more Smallville because I think he probably was an amazing Lex Luthor. I'm just not as familiar with it. I love him as a person, though. Like, I would follow him to the ends of the earth, but I should probably watch more Smallville.
But yeah, I thought I'd speak up for the people who commented on that one. All right, Dennis.
For me, I've choose a Storm, and even though X-Men can be hit or miss depending on the team, one of the runs I loved was when it was the all-female team, because one, it was one of the greatest lineups ever, and I thought it was a testament to how strong so many great female characters have been in the X-Men universe. But with her, just for what she stands for, and she kind of embodies, it being a metaphor for civil rights, her being a black woman, a goddess in her own right, and just what she's accomplished just as an iconic superhero. But she was kind of the one that I looked to and that really, resonated with me and I have a rapport with. The other one is Midnighter, and Steve Orlando's run was everything, and it was just nice to see an LGBTQ gay action hero who can basically say Punisher, Sabretooth, Deadpool, Wolverine, and Batman are all punks, and he can actually back it up. So it was just like he's fun and he's multifaceted, and another groundbreaking character in his own right too. So those are my two that I go to and definitely recommend.
Excellent. Those are some awesome examples. I like how many villains were in there because it could have been heroes or villains, and everybody's like, "Oh, this villain, they're awesome." We've got another question from the Peanut Gallery, which is, what is a mistake you've seen people make writing superhero novels that might not always rear its ugly head in other genres? Does anybody want to volunteer for that one? Jeff?
Yeah, I wrote my first superhero novel, and I forgot to explain why guns didn't work in the world. And mistake. I got to the big battle. It's in, I won't tell you the novel because I don't want to ruin the ending, but I got to the big battle at the end, and they're having a giant fist fight on a hill with all the villains. And I remember I wrote this novel like 7 years ago, but I remember one of my reviewers was like, "Man, fun and exciting novel. I don't know why somebody just didn't pull out a gun and end the whole thing." And so I had to go into book 2 and like explain that aspect of the world. But I think that's one of the dangers of writing superhero novels is that the world is so huge that making sure we're covering all the logical pieces of it is important. And that's a place where I just failed until book 2 to explain this really critical aspect of the world, how the world functions.
Welcome back, Dennis. Anyone else?
For me, it's limits. In superhero fiction, sometimes we forget to give our superpowered characters limits. We forget that they're going to need to use the bathroom. We forget that they're going to have to eat. We forget that they're going to get tired. And if they're not going to get tired, we don't explain why. We make these heroes because we want them to solve the problem, and then we make them so powerful that they solve the problem so easily that the reader doesn't realize there was ever a problem to begin with, and they're like, why did I read this book of just boring going from point A to point B and this hero solving problems far too easily? So I think a big thing that happens more in the world of superpowered characters than it does in a world of mundane characters, even when those characters use magic. For whatever reason, we as people who write things, for whatever reason, magic feels like it has limits. Naturally, we will put limits on that. But sometimes when it is something that is considered a superpower, a thing that you are rather than a thing that you do, there is sometimes a tendency, particularly with new storytellers, to forget to build the walls, just like Jeff mentioned, not remembering to bake into the world building something he knew all along, which is that guns aren't going to work. You try to pop a cap in the villain and it's going to do a little flag that says pow. So I think that's a big one. I think it's knowing where and how to build the walls, both with your characters and with your world building, that can trip up people new to superhero fiction in a way that it doesn't tend to trip up sci-fi authors and fantasy authors quite the same way.
Because they've had to define their aliens or whatever because it's a new world.
Yes.
All right. Nancy or Dennis, did either one of you?
Sure. I have I don't think this is strictly a superhero problem, but the fact that, because it happens in fantasy and it happens in more supernatural stories, but the fact that no one stays dead is something that actually drives me kind of nuts. This is probably more of a comic issue than it is a fiction issue because, fiction books, eventually we're planning on ending the series, whereas superhero comics go on for, all time. But the fact that whenever someone dies, I feel like in a superhero story and in comics especially, you're almost like counting down the days of like, when are they going to bring back Thor or not Thor, Spider-Man, for example, or depowering someone in the case of Thor. And it gives a situation where it feels like a lot of these big, larger than life actions don't have consequences because they don't always stick. And that is something that drives me up the wall at times, I must admit.
Dennis?
This one definitely falls. I guess you can find this in any genre, but I definitely have noticed this in superhero and especially in the MCU. One thing I would state is that just because a story is told from someone's perspective, it does not necessarily make them a good guy. Yeah, we're following them on their journey, but just because we're following them doesn't mean that they aren't fallible or aren't doing villainous things themselves. And just because the superhero is straight, white, and male doesn't mean that they aren't monsters themselves. And I will point to Tony Stark. I had a discussion about that because one of the things he was able, especially Robert Downey, which to him, he's an amazing actor, but one of the reasons why he was able to get away with some of the stuff, he nearly destroyed the planet when he created Ultron and did a bunch of other stuff, but because he was charming, rich, and had privilege, he was able to get pass after pass after pass. Then you look at him and Thanos, and it's like, they're not that different in certain respects, and there are some parallels there. And I think that's something too, because you start looking at, would we still be as empathetic with this person if this was a woman doing the same thing? Would we be empathetic or defending them if this was a person of color or if they were an LGBTQ? And I think those are definitely things you want to keep in mind too when we're creating stories, because that can be an unconscious bias, or it can also hurt your story. It's not to say that they can't mess up or they can't be fallible, but it's also too, I think it's important in a story to call them out on their BS instead of trying to justify them. Yeah, you are the hero of the story, but for the first half, you've been a jerk, and you need to make things right. So I think that's something to keep in mind also.
Yeah, absolutely. Personally, what I hate, and you do see this in the movies, it does happen in other genres, but it is rampant in superhero stuff, is like Nancy said, they do something big and there's no consequences. Yes, it's cool to see Superman punch Zod through the skyscraper. However, this is a live action movie, there's a lot of deaths that just occurred there. And that doesn't get hit at all. You get the amusing scene where like the helicopter runs halfway through an office and people are in the office throwing up their arms and screaming. But you don't actually see the fact that, well, the upper floors might collapse at that point and they have just killed a bunch of people. So I think that lack of consequences Nancy mentioned, a lot of superhero authors, and I may have killed a few people myself, as I have set on fire, and I think I also exploded a building. But, well, It probably should have been demolished anyway. Those old insane asylums that have been repurposed
I
never
burned down a
end
police
well.
station, and I
Yeah.
regret nothing.
In a mystery novel, one time I killed an FBI agent in chapter 4, and then totally forgot to come back to the death and what happened to her.
Wow.
Well, she stayed
But,
dead at least.
She did
But
stay
yeah,
dead.
so consequences. The massive NPC deaths don't necessarily prove that your character is incredibly powerful so much as it proves they're incredibly careless.
We have a
Okay.
superhero in Cobalt City who actually keeps the newspaper stories of all the collateral damage, terrible things that he's responsible for, framed on the walls of his office to remind him that there are other people besides him and whoever he's up against in that moment. He is a capital G good guy. Bless him.
That's awesome. Okay. All right. We are about out of time. So, as much as I'd love to get to the questions we just got, why don't we all do our little farewells? Let's start with Dennis. Just remind people where they can find your books, your work, and, hopefully purchase a few things for some really cool reading. Go ahead, Dennis.
Sorry. Yes, you can find me on dennisupkins.wordpress.com. That's my blog. On Twitter, I'm Dr. Upkins. Facebook, Denny Upkins, and same goes for Instagram. You can find my work there. Currently, I'm writing for Out Voices Nashville. It's an LGBTQ magazine, and usually anytime I have anything coming up or anything published, I'll usually announce it on the site, on my website. So you can find me there, and feel free to have me. And thank you guys for having me too. I've had fun.
It's been awesome having you here with us. All right, Amanda.
Hi again. I am Amanda Cherry at Manda the Ginger on Twitter. www.thegingervillain.com is my website that I mostly remember to update when I'm doing convention appearances, except this week because, that whole electricity thing. Mostly I'm on Twitter. You can also find me facebook.com/thegingervillain, but I forget it exists and don't always update it either. I am terrible with technology, but I will tweet at you. My debut super book is called Rights and Desires. You can find that all of the usual places books are sold. And you can find my other stuff also on my website. So follow me on Twitter. I'm hilarious.
That's always a bonus in my book. Nancy.
Sure. Again, I'm Nancy O'Toole. You can find my website. It's at nancyotoole.wordpress.com. I'm also on Twitter at WatchNancyTweets. And I forgot to mention this in the intro, but I have a podcast. I'm the co-host of One for All, a My Hero Academia podcast. So if you enjoy MHA, you can listen to the podcast. And if you enjoy MHA, you can come to our manga and anime superhero panel that's going to be here tomorrow.
Okay, Jeff.
You can find me. My website is jeffalkinswriter.com. You can get my books pretty much wherever they're sold. My homeless superhero series, The Defense of Reality, starts with the book 12 Commandments, and it's on sale right now for 99 cents. If you go to my website and sign up for my newsletter, you get a copy of my the first book in my supernatural thriller mystery series called Grab. And if you want to listen to me talk about writing, I podcast as The Dialogue Doctor. So you can find my podcast, The Dialogue Doctor, pretty much anywhere podcasts are. You can come look for me on Twitter, but I am not funny on Twitter. I'm a dad with 5 kids. There's nothing funny going on here. But that's where you can find my books.
Okay, and I am Karen Diem. I write the ARCA superhero series. You can find information about my stuff on www.karendiem.com. I do sometimes tweet on Twitter, and I can tell there's a couple people I need to follow. And I spend a lot of time bopping on and off the superhero-fiction Discord server, so you can catch me there and tell me how wrong I am about things if you want. So buy my books. They're on Amazon and everywhere else too. That'd be good. My kid needs, food. Anyway, thanks for listening. Enjoy the rest of the panels. I'll be on the world building panel later in the week.